That is to say, everything is shaped by context, and it has meanings that extend beyond just what you yourself as an athlete or coach think of when you apply a verse or when you're part of an organization or a network. Even things that you might not be intentionally thinking of, you're bound up in a web of meaning and a narrative that does shape American public life in some ways. And the political and the cultural does shape how Christians have engaged in sports. And that context matters. And so in my own writing, I try to bring out that context and try to say, on the one hand, yes, it's true, athletes and coaches aren't necessarily political activists, many of them. But it's also true that some of the organizations that they develop and some of the ways they engage in sports, it's intended to promote a particular vision of American society and a particular vision of American life. Christians, they don't have consensus on what to do about sports and what are the appropriate boundaries. And in a lot of ways, it's always been seen as a potential competitor for time and attention that should go to God. And so what Muscular Christianity does, though, is it emerges at a time when, in the English-speaking, for English-speaking Protestants, there is a suspicion of particular types of sports. There is a worry that sports are being played on Sundays, so we're breaking the Sabbath by playing sports on Sunday. It's connected to this bachelor subculture of young men who are gambling and drinking and having sex and doing all these other behaviors that Christians say these are sins. We don't want to be participating in that. And so because of those connotations that this sports culture has, for a lot of Christians, they're hesitant to engage in it. And then there's just the question of, like, what's a good use of your time?
Welcome to the Upwards podcast. I'm Dan, one of your hosts, and this is a podcast where we discuss the intersection of Christian faith in the academy, church, and marketplace to illuminate the good work happening with individuals, institutions, and in our communities. I'm here today with Paul Putz, who's the director of Faith and Sports of the Faith and Sports Institute at Baylor University's Truett Theological Seminary. Hi, Paul.
Hey, Dan. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it's great to be with you. We're both historians. We both, I think, are around the same age, and so we've sort of been in similar social circles, academic circles. It's good to sit down and actually have a long conversation where we get to learn a bit about the topic today, which is faith and sports and the intersection of those two things. A little more about Paul. Paul received his BA from Grace University in Omaha, Nebraska, which I just learned no longer exists, and I guess there's probably a growing number of people, depending on where you went, that have that little asterisk next to their alma mater. But then Paul went to a place that will probably exist for a very long time, which is Baylor University. He got his PhD in history from Baylor, and he spent over a decade as a high school teacher and in college classrooms teaching. And he's written for a number of popular outlets, including Christianity Today, Slate, Religion News Service. He's been on NPR and elsewhere. And at the end of our conversation today, we'll talk about his book that is coming out, The Spirit of the Game, American Christianity and Big Time Sports. It's coming out on October 2nd with Oxford University Press. So Paul is the perfect person to talk to today about the intersection of faith and sports, something maybe a lot of us think about periodically. Maybe we see news stories about the intersection of religion and sports, but here we're going to talk about it in a little more focused way. So to start us off, Paul, just let us get a sense of what made you interested in this area of study at the intersection of faith and sports from a historical perspective.
I think it began from liking sports, and I grew up as a pastor's kid. My dad was a UPS truck driver. He did that full time and then had this little church he pastored alongside that. So religion is central to who I am, but sports were a big part of what I like to do too. I grew up in small town Nebraska. And so I'm playing football in the falls and baseball in the summer and basketball in the winter, doing all the sports and watching games on television. And so I think just that interest from early on was big. But I loved reading about sports too. So when I'm getting the newspaper, I'm going to the sports page and I'm trying to read up on the past legends of the game and whatever, the NBA or the NFL. So there's also a narrative element to sports that I think there is a drama, a story that shaped who I was and what I was interested in going through high school. in terms of the historical aspect of that, I don't really enter into that until I am a high school teacher. So you mentioned Grace University, went to this small Christian college, played small college basketball there, and I thought I'd be a basketball coach. And in my experience, if you want to coach, you teach a lot of times social studies. That was what I saw. And, the social studies teacher putting on the video of some American history PBS documentary and then game planning at their desk. I mean, that was kind of the image I had. But I fell in love with teaching history in the classroom and decided, instead of being a coach, that maybe I can do this history thing. I found that I liked research and I liked writing. And so as I was trying to figure out what do I want to explore when it comes to the study of American Christianity, because that was kind of my area, my interest, sports just came up because it was central to who I was. And I'd been formed by some of these Christian sports organizations like the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. So I go to get my PhD at Baylor University, and I'm just trying to figure out what am I going to spend 5 years of my life studying. And for me, I wanted to study something I was passionate about and explore questions I didn't see answers to. And so that's kind of what led me down that path.
Was there ever a moment growing up, I guess, where the intersection between faith and sports clicked, or you saw how they directly fed into each other, or was that just something that sort of organically emerged as you were in both of those worlds a lot?
I felt a lot of tension early on, honestly. There was, so I grew up in a conservative evangelical home, charismatic, speaking in tongues was common in our church. And so there's a suspicion of the world that I was raised to just be on guard. And even other Christians, maybe there were a lot of nominal Christians, I was told. And so if you really wanted to follow Jesus, you needed to guard yourself against being influenced by the world. And sports was a worldly activity. And so even as I'm playing sports, I'm kind of careful. You don't want to turn it into an idol. You don't want to have it take you away from who you are as a Christian. You're around on a sports team, you're around people who aren't Christians, and some of them curse and some of them talk in ways that I'm not used to hearing. And so it also exposed me to people who weren't part of my little subculture in terms of church. And yeah, that raised a sense of, can these things hold together? Can I really follow Jesus in the way I'm being taught I need to, but then also try to be this basketball player? And I saw that integration piece for me happen through people like my high school basketball coach. His name was Joel Heiser, and he was part of the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. And for him, he was a Christian and figuring out, here's how I can model Christianity, model my faith and live it out. But he was also a competitor, and he, loved basketball and taught us how to play well and compete and had success. So I looked for examples like him and organizations like the FCA that helped me think through how to bring those identities together.
You mentioned basketball as a really important sport for you. Were there other sports that you and are particularly interested in, either playing or keeping track of, either as a fan or as a scholar, I guess?
Growing up in Nebraska, football is huge. And I grew up in the 90s when we were good at football. And what's unique culturally about football there is lots of states love football. It's not like Nebraska's unique there, but not many states have almost nothing else in terms of sports to follow. We don't have any professional teams. We don't have any other major college teams. So you think about even a place like Wisconsin, like y'all do have a state school that's like the preeminent state university, right? There's not like multiple universities competing for attention there, but you have the Green Bay Packers. So there's other sports teams that can get your loyalty. In Nebraska, it is the University of Nebraska. And growing up in the 90s, we were really successful. And so the whole state just gets behind the football team, gets behind the athletic program. And I bought into that. I was, the first time I remember crying was when the college football team for Nebraska loses against the University of Miami in like 1992. And it was emotional, but you also connected with your neighbors and people you didn't know. You could talk about the game with them because everyone's watching. So college football was big as something to follow. To play, I stopped after ninth grade. I wasn't cut out for it. I was like a fourth string quarterback. So I stopped. And baseball, I couldn't hit the curveball. So once pitchers started throwing curves, I was done at about ninth grade. But I still had a passion for, again, the stories of the game. I would read sports writers, loved sports journalism, worked for the student newspaper as a sports journalist, even as I'm playing on the basketball team. So yeah, I never lost an interest, even though basketball by ninth grade became the one sport that I actively played.
Now, you've been in Texas for quite a few years. Have you adopted any of the Texas loyalties?
Baylor. I mean, I'm a Bear.
Okay.
They give me my paycheck, so I'm easy to be swayed. If Baylor were to play Nebraska, though, that's where that you just can't top kind of your childhood loyalties, your childhood teams. But I do love being at Baylor. I've appreciated what Baylor represents, and then when you get to know some of the athletes or the coaches, and you have some personal connections, you just buy in more. So I'm all in on the Bears, and that means there's just not many other teams in Texas that I can follow. You got to pick one here. I've learned you have your Aggies and your Red Raiders and your Longhorns, and I'm riding with the Bears. So it's all Baylor for me.
And Baylor's done quite well in recent years in a number of sports. I grew up close by to you, actually, in Colorado, and so grew up in Colorado Springs for many years. So the Air Force Academy is that team that I sort of irrationally still root for, even though I have very little connection to Colorado Springs anymore or the Air Force Academy. There's that childhood loyalty that just can't go away ever.
Yeah,
seems like.
It's funny how that sticks around, right?
Yeah.
Some sort of nostalgia, and it's interesting for me. I had a little bit of a period where I quote, let's call it deconstruction. I deconstructed from my sports fandom a little bit because I'm starting to do my master's program, and I'm thinking, the sports stuff like University of Nebraska, everyone's on board with it. Like, let me be the nonconformist a little bit. So I would still follow, but not as closely. When I moved to Texas, and my wife Bethany and I, we had lived in Nebraska for 28 years. I moved to Texas to get my PhD program to go to Baylor. And I started following Nebraska more than I ever had before. And it was like this point of connection with home. It was a sense of home. And I think that's when we talk about like the deeper meaning of sports, why does it resonate? It's because it represents other things. It's like if you just pause to think about what goes on in any sport, you're just like, okay, some athletes, they stand on a hardwood floor, and there's this cylinder they toss back and forth, and they try to throw it through a hoop. And just at a base level, like, why do we care? But It's because that's bound up with all of these other meanings. And one of the biggest meanings and narratives is it's tied to a place. It's tied to a location. It's tied to a community. And you identify with that community through this highly emotional sports competition. And then when you have those experiences as a kid and as you're growing up, it just kind of builds in some of those connections that don't ever really go away. So for me with Nebraska, I saw that play out, and it sounds like for you with Air Force, which is shout out to you, because I don't think I've ever met like a hardcore Air Force fan, but
I'm not as hardcore as I once was, but it's still that team where no matter who they're against, I'm going to be rooting for Air Force and actually care about the game, which they're not a premier team in any sport. Every once in a while they make a little run, but I think you're right about the deeper meaning of sports. I mean, that might bring us into a conversation about getting a PhD and studying sports. I think for the outside observer to academia or what it takes to get a PhD in a field like history, it might be hard to imagine, what does it mean to get a PhD in sports? I mean, are you memorizing every championship from the beginning of every league, or obviously that's not what's happening, but maybe that's part of it. I don't know. What does it mean to sort of deeply study the history of sports and its intersection with religion? How did that go about?
Yeah, it kind of depends on your discipline. So one thing that's interesting when you study sports from a humanities level, kind of makes you not like it as much. For most people, scholars who study sports tend to be pretty critical of it. It's like the thing you love. Once you start to really explore it from a critical lens, you realize there's all these things about it historically and even today that aren't so fun to think about, or that are troubling even. And this goes for me as a Christian. When I study the history of American Christianity, it's similar. And yeah, when you study sports, you're going to see ways that it's been used to dehumanize or to potentially oppress or whitewash. You can go on down the line. So a lot of people who end up studying sports, maybe they love sports and they start to get into it. But once you get the PhD and you're engaging with critical sports scholarship, it really is an area where it can kind of take away some of that fandom. For me, the opposite happened. I mentioned that earlier, which was interesting. The more I even engage with critical sports studies scholarship, I kind of just leaned into embracing sport as this connection point, as this narrative that helped give some meaning to my life and was enjoyable to follow, but also helped me understand, like human beings and human culture. I think that's what's exciting to me when I think about sports. It's how it really is a cultural text, I guess is what we could say. And that's something that I learned as I got into my PhD. When I'm playing sports, and even when I'm a high school teacher, I'm not going around talking about sports as a cultural text. And people who are engaged in it, they aren't, they don't love it because of that. So, but when you start to study it, I think you can begin to unpack those meanings. In terms of like how you get into sports, there's different fields. There's sports history, which is a unique discipline because it in some ways is connected to kind of traditional history as a discipline, but really was formed out of kinesiology. And so it kind of has as this interdisciplinary subfield where people like someone who's a sports historian is more likely to be part of a department that's kinesiology or physical education in the past, rather than maybe in a traditional history department. And so that shapes the field. For me, I wanted to enter into the study of sports through another discipline. So coming to Baylor University, there's no one who's a sports historian. There were a lot of people who studied American religion, and that's what I wanted to study. I wanted to study American Christianity because that was another part of my life that was important in shaping who I was. But I wanted sports to be a lens into understanding American Christianity. So for me, it was never just about, let me study sports for sports' sake. Let me know the champions and who's won all the titles. Like, I can do that on my own time, but that's not what interests me about history. History is interesting because of what it tells us about human beings, cultures, societies, communities, and Christianity in this case. And I felt that sports is this unique part of our culture that Christians have been deeply engaged with. And there's room there to explore what that means for American Christianity. So, I describe myself as a sports historian because I do study sports and I engage with sports history scholarship and publish pieces related to sports history. But in terms of my training and the people who were around me, none of them were sports historians. They were all American religious historians. And there's some good that comes from that. I think when you study sports, but you come at it from some other discipline or some other field, in some ways it can open up new areas of exploration or maybe new questions to pursue too.
It's very interesting. I want to get to a question just in a second, just to round out the conversation around the stats part of it, or the sort of the talk radio maybe part of how many of us consume sports. But first of all, I want to remind listeners that the podcast notes for today's conversation include a link to view this episode on YouTube. You can see Paul's amazing background. It looks like he has actually put some curation into his background of books behind him. And so if you're interested in watching this episode on YouTube, head there and remember to subscribe to Upper House for any future podcast episodes. Paul, on memorizing stats. So I started as a diplomatic historian, and I remember early on realizing, particularly when I started teaching, that I actually needed to grasp a good amount of, you could say, memorizable facts to even have credibility. If I didn't know, to put it pretty bluntly, if I didn't know all the presidents and when they served their terms, that was going to be a problem if a student started asking about something and sort of they were, they had more knowledge, sort of base knowledge than me. There's a lot of student interest, at least sometimes, with military history and how that intersects with diplomatic history. And so, knowing at least the basic narratives of some of the major battles in American history really helped me out as a sort of credibility. And I imagine I mentioned this to you before we talked, I TA'd once for a sports history class here at UW-Madison. So it was a big class. It was the most popular class in the history department. Over 200 students were taking it at a time. And so I knew a lot of the students were in there because they liked sports and they liked the statistics. They liked talking about who was better, LeBron James or Michael Jordan, all those types of sort of popular conversations. And the course was taught as if sports was a cultural text, as you said. And so that really did not come up much. In fact, the professor was sort of dead set against that type of talking about it. And I always wondered as I was teaching that, like, is there a way to do this where you can bridge these things and not, and there are many athletes in the course as well. And I know many of them wanted to just talk about sports, sort of as an, from the level of experience more than history. But anyway, I'm sure you've thought about these things too, but how do you go about sort of trying to bridge what many people are bringing to the topic of sports and then what you want to get across as a scholar of sports? That's
a great question. And that tension, different scholars and professors wrestle with it in different ways. So I definitely know there are a lot of sports historians who would have a problem coming across as a fan. And they would want to say, no, I study this critically and I can't engage in it at that level. And my job, again, is to critically analyze it. That's not for me. I see the interest in sports as at the level, again, of stats, of championships, of just the drama of competition. I see that as something I don't want to take away from people. And I want to meet students there because I don't think we have too many points of connection in our culture and society of just enjoyable. Like at its base level, yes, sport does have all these cultural meanings that help to give it significance, but it also is fun. It's something that people just enjoy watching. It can be an escape. When it's an escape, that's not to say that it doesn't carry political or cultural significance. It does, but for a lot of people, when they engage in it, they're not bringing those questions to mind. They just enjoy it. And so I like meeting students at that level. I like joking with them. If I find out their favorite players or I find out their favorite teams, then it's great to bring up those conversations and to keep it lighthearted and to maybe make some jokes or to talk about who my favorite teams are. I found that's a good point of connection, and I try to encourage that. Right. When it comes to studying, though, when it comes to getting into, like, all right, now we have a lecture, or now we're reading some text, or now we have an exam, or here's the things I expect you to learn from this class. I've never expected students to know stats or details that they can just learn on their own time and enjoy and follow. And I did that as a kid. I memorized stats. Like that's a great thing. That's not coming up in the classes I teach. Again, I'll use that. I'll talk about that. I'll allow us to enjoy sports for what it is. But I'm interested in some other questions that, historians are interested in pursuing. And so I do want to help them begin to think about sports through a historical lens and with the tools of a historian. And that necessarily means we have to understand sports or think about it in a different way, a way that's uncomfortable for a lot of athletes. So I guess I'm kind of a middle ground position there where I try to allow sports to be multiple things. And I don't try to take away what it means to an athlete or coach who experiences it on a day-to-day level. I try not to force them to become historians themselves, necessarily. If that's a path they want to do and go get your PhD, let's have a different conversation. But if you're just in this class because you need a history class and you love sports, I really try to enter them into a story and give them some tools for historical thinking that hopefully down the road they can continue to draw on. So I think of it as a conversation starter and continuer. Don't want to stop it because they enter a sports class and now they don't like sports anymore. More than likely, actually, they don't like the class anymore. But I try to meet them where they're at and help reframe sports a little bit for them, where they analyze it from another lens while still holding fast to what made them love sports in the first place. Sure, that makes a lot of sense. When you, let's just get into how you present sports from a historical perspective. So I assume you teach, maybe I'll ask you, what classes do you teach on sports history? Yeah, so it's been interesting. Context matters here too. I taught at Messiah University for a year. And that was my first job after a PhD. And I taught a class on sports and the meaning of American life. And then I taught another class on sports and race and politics in the 20th century. So I taught a couple sports classes there. One was for freshmen entering the university, and one was for upper-level history majors. And then where I am now at Truett Seminary, I teach a sports and Christianity and historical perspective class for people who are at a seminary because they're interested in ministry. So you think about those three different groups, right? We have a Messiah freshmen who are taking this history class really to learn basic college writing skills. So like a lot of universities, Messiah has some classes set up where you pick a subject that you're interested in, but through that subject, you're really learning how to be a college student. So that was one history class. The other history class I have, upper level history majors. And then again, at the seminary, it's people interested in ministry. So in all of those cases, what those students are wanting is different, and what they're capable of doing is different too. And so I try to keep that in mind. With the freshmen entering, they are just beginning to even figure out, like, what does it mean to critically analyze something? How do we think critically about a text? And so my expectations there are really just to begin a conversation that they can continue throughout their college career. And I don't expect them to become historians right away, but I give them some tools here and there to think about, just things like, how do we put a text in context? That's a big piece. I just let's contextualize something. So let's take an event, or let's take a narrative about sports, and let's figure out how it has cultural meaning. And so I'll begin to do that with freshmen. With upper level history, when I'm teaching it, you can go much deeper. People have bought into it. They've been taking history classes. They have some tools that you can build on. So in that case, we can really dive deep into primary source analysis. We can begin to make sense of historical narratives. We can look at contingency and change over time. And that's kind of my historians class. So I love teaching that upper level history class because we could just go deep into it. At the ministry level, at the seminary, what's interesting there is we have high level students, but they aren't trying to be historians. They didn't take this class because I want to be a historian myself someday. They took the class because they want to minister more effectively. Like, they're in seminary because they want to serve God. And so they're coming to the class thinking, how can history help me do that well? And that's it. There's an extra step there that I wasn't trained to do when I got my PhD in history. We're taught not to do that, right? To kind of think through, okay, well, so what? Now what's next? And what I try to do in that class is give students, again, historical thinking tools. Let's contextualize sources. But then I allow them some space to think through for themselves, like, what might this mean in my ministry context? So at the seminary level, there's that extra piece they're adding to the history that I wouldn't have done in an undergrad classroom, but that is appropriate for a seminary setting.
Yeah, and what I'm hearing from you, Paul, is that there's a lot of emphasis you put on not just the content, the substance of the history, but the craft of being a historian, or how historical knowledge can affect your life or affect your work in different ways. And that's where the audience really comes into play, because depending on who you're talking to, that's going to be answered differently depending on why they're in the room, and what ultimately their career trajectory is. So that's very thoughtful. I think that's what good teachers do. If you were to say, one of the courses you said you talked about was Christianity in sports and historical perspective. And so if you were to do the syllabus on that, where would you start historically, and why? And if you can just give us a sense of, like, what's the shape of that story up to generally the modern day?
We start that class in the New Testament. So we go back 2,000 years ago and look at early Christian responses to sports. How are they understanding it? And that's because the New Testament references sports. So in that class, we kind of begin early on and just look at what the kind of the early sections of the class. We see these verses in the Bible, but what was the context out of which those verses developed? What did sports look like at the time it was written? So it's great because it's an entry point for students to take something very familiar to them. At seminary, they know their Bible well, and they've heard these verses. Many of the students in the class like sports, like Christianity. They've maybe written down a verse, a sports-related verse on their shoe as they, go out and play in the high school sports or something. So they know the verse well, and now we can begin to, it takes on a deeper meaning when they begin to understand, well, what was the Greco-Roman athletic world like? And then to think about, there's images of gladiators and how that plays into this Christian resistance to sports. I think it's also good because we're used to, especially in the Midwest and in the South, the Bible Belt areas where I've lived and grown up, most Christians just kind of like sports, and it's just for sort of ordinary Christian communities, it's a part of everyday life, and there's not a lot of critical thinking about it necessarily. It's just, this is a good thing, and let's talk about Jesus through sports. And so they read some early Christian texts, and you're reading Novatius, and you're reading Tertullian, and you're reading these church fathers who don't like sports at all, and they're critiquing it heavily. And so it allows students to enter into that, oh, this is a contested terrain. This is, there's these verses about athletic competition, but the story of how Christians are thinking about sports, it's much deeper than that. It's more complex. And so I like to use the beginning of the course to start to address those questions. We move on from there to the Middle Ages, and we start to think through some Catholic engagement with sports. Aquinas writes about sports as a place where virtue can be developed when it's done in moderation. So some of the beginnings of sports for formation we can see there. There's also connections with the Crusades and with violence and with the Sabbath for the Puritans. Some of these questions of Sunday sports, they're really emerging, hundreds, thousands of years ago. So I like students to see that we're part of an ongoing story when it comes to the Christian community and when we wrestle with sports. But the bulk of the class does focus, after we talk about the early church and the Middle Ages, it does focus on more the modern world of sports, because for as much as, yes, sports existed in the Greco-Roman world, and yes, competitions existed right in the Middle Ages, the way sports functions today is different. And it's bureaucratized. It is a vocation. It becomes a part of life that can shape your entire life. It's not just a thing that the village does because farming is done for the year and let's celebrate and let's, have a soccer game or some early version of baseball like they would have done in the Middle Ages. It's not like a seasonal thing that you do to celebrate. No, it's an everyday, this is my job, this is my life, this is what I dedicate myself to type of thing. And that world emerges really in the 19th century and beyond. And so we focus a lot on, where does that come from? Where does our particular modern sports world come from? And then how have Christians engaged and wrestled with that and made meaning from it and tried to figure out what are the appropriate ways Christians should engage in this?
And so many of the trends that lead to the bureaucratization, the professionalization of sports are trends, of course, that are affecting American society more broadly, thus making a really interesting lens into, some really broad themes also in American history, not just relevant to sports. I think of one, period, late 19th, early 20th century, when historians talk about this idea of muscular Christianity, this idea that actually one of the best things a Christian, particularly a young man, I think, could do would be to be part of a sports team. And I think about your earlier comment about your upbringing, that other traditions within Christianity looked really skeptically at the role that sports could play in the character formation or sort of the worldliness of a young person. How do you talk about that theme? And here we're just talking about basically two different Protestant views. So, I mean, there's a much wider gamut than just those two. But how do you talk about a theme like that, where we're thinking about sports and its relationship to Christianity and how Christians have either embraced it or not over the longer trajectory of American history?
Yeah, I always try to emphasize that it's been contested from the very beginning. Christians, they don't have consensus on what to do about sports and what are the appropriate boundaries. And in a lot of ways, it's always been seen as a potential competitor for time and attention that should go to God. And so what Muscular Christianity does, though, is it emerges at a time when, in the English-speaking Protestants, there is a suspicion of particular types of sports. There is a worry that sports are being played on Sundays, so we're breaking the Sabbath by playing sports on Sunday. It's connected to this bachelor subculture of young men who are gambling and drinking and having sex and doing all these other behaviors that Christians say these are sins. We don't want to be participating in that. And so because of those connotations that this sports culture has, for a lot of Christians, they're hesitant to engage in it. And then there's just the question of, like, what's a good use of your time? And there's just a long trajectory, I think, in Christianity of this sort of Platonic dualism, this sense of, hey, what really matters is the invisible spiritual realm. And that can kind of be morphed into this like intellectualism, right? What really matters is your mind and what you think. That's what's most important. So we need to pursue, reading the Bible and writing about the Bible and the things of the mind and the things of the heart, the things of the spirit. That's what God deeply values. And the body is actually something to be suspicious of. We need to worry about the flesh. We need to worry about those desires. And so in that, Victorian era context, when you combine those elements of this bachelor subculture with sports, this sense that it's not a good use of time, this suspicion of the body, you just get a lot of red flags for Protestants when they think about sports. Muscular Christians come along and they really want to emphasize that, no, actually the body matters and is a good thing. We want to use our body for godly ends, but we don't necessarily need to be suspicious of it in the way that some Christians and some Protestants had been. So muscular Christians are trying to develop this view of a well-rounded man, and man in particular. There's some gender ideologies going on there, but a well-rounded man who mind, body, soul is this unified whole, and that Christians need to pay attention to their bodies. The body matters deeply. So there's something for muscular Christians, I think there's a healthy correction in some ways when it comes to especially the understanding of the body that then ties into sports. And so if your body matters and it's good to exercise and to develop your body, then sports can be a way to do that. Now, physical competition and running and throwing and playing these games, that can become something godly, something that actually is used to develop yourself spiritually. And in the process, then sports becomes one of these avenues through which to do that. But muscular Christians they're still worried about some of the excesses of sports. And so for them, they would say sports needs to be carefully regulated. You need to have certain well-trained Christian leaders who are mature, who can make sure that when these young men are engaging in sports, it's done for the purposes of moral formation, so that you do get what's good about sports instead of some of these vices that had been connected to sports in the past. And it's out of muscular Christianity that sports like basketball are created. Organizations like the YMCA, although it doesn't begin as a muscular Christian organization, over time they embrace sports as a key part of their mission, and they help to develop the sports infrastructure of the United States. Even things like the football coach as a profession is connected to muscular Christianity. Again, I mentioned basketball earlier. Volleyball is another. These are sports that are created by Christians as part of this muscular Christian movement that is trying to recapture or claim a moral value for sports. And that's part of the story to me is fascinating. And students are always fascinated by that, to think through Christians playing a formative role in creating and shaping culture, and not just kind of taking what's been given and reacting to it in certain ways.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, would you see the contemporary, like sort of the modern, at least in some parts, maybe in the South in particular, but elsewhere, it's sort of, there's a pretty strong Christian culture around, particularly like college sports, college football maybe, where there's a strong, all the athletes are praying at the beginning of the game, and there's a sense of the pastor being able to cite Bible verses and other things in his speeches to the team and everything. Is that, do you see that as just sort of muscular Christianity, 21st century version? Or is there something else that happened between then and now that helps explain why we see overt expressions of Christianity in some parts of, let's keep it at college sports, but some parts of the sports world today?
Well, I have a book coming out that'll she's all these. I know we're talking about that later, but I do have a chapter particularly on how it becomes so central to the South, because you're right. When you think about college football and Southern identity and the way religion is connected to that, it's prominent in the South, and in a way maybe it's not in some other places. What I would say is there's some differences there. I don't think it's just muscular Christianity. Muscular Christianity emerges from England, and then it's adopted by these elite institutions in the Northeast, like Yale and Harvard and Princeton. And so it has these connotations of the gentleman, the person of means, right? Someone who's well off. And they engage in muscular Christianity because you want the quote-unquote future leaders, white, male, Anglo-Saxon, to also have sound bodies to go along with their sound minds as they lead the country into the future. So there's absolutely a racialized dimension of muscular Christianity too, especially at those elite institutions, as I mentioned. What happens is, as muscular Christians try to develop sports, and as they try to really create a culture, a Christian culture of sports, sports just kind of takes off in ways they can't control. And so in 1891, you have basketball is created at the YMCA for Christian purposes, but it takes off not because people are playing it and they're like, oh, this is great, I'm now growing as a Christian. It takes off because people love it and they're paying money to watch it and they're following teams, and games are, there's a commercialization that happens. And so as sports takes off culturally, and as it becomes commercialized, there's these new tensions that muscular Christians are feeling, because for them, sports has value if it builds character, and it builds character if it's connected to this ideology of amateurism. Again, the idea of the gentleman athlete who plays the game for the love of the game and not for money, not for some other purpose. Once you start to enter ticket sales and attention and fame and celebrity and commercialization, the ideology of muscular Christianity loses some of its foundation. And so by the 1920s, which is called the golden age of sports, because this is really when, as at a national level, sports takes off in American society. It's soon after radio is created. There's newsreels. It's after World War I. And so people are looking for these escapist consumer cultural activities. So sports becomes this national phenomenon in the 1920s in a new way. And it's deeply tied in with consumerism in a way that makes some muscular Christians skeptical and suspicious. So what I would say is it's in the 1920s that muscular Christianity is reframed. And instead of muscular Christians being people who can shape culture towards Christian ends, shape sports culture, they have to accommodate and adapt to a culture they don't control. And they have to figure out, can Christian virtue and values still be cultivated in this consumer culture activity? Because that's what sports is. It's both educational and it's also commercialized. And that requires accommodation as strategies. And that develops more often in booster cultures of the Midwest in particular. I mean, I think of Sinclair Lewis's, he has these trio of books in the 1920s where he just is criticizing this middle class, Midwestern booster culture, Main Street and Babbitt and, Elmer Gantry. Yeah. And those books, I think, get at some Americans' reaction to this uncritical embrace of sports, money, business, and how those are tied together. But what a lot of Christians end up doing is they aren't enjoying Sinclair Lewis's take on it. They're like, this is a good thing. We believe fully in business success leads from athletic success. There's a new ideology that doesn't shy away from commercialization, but instead accepts it as a healthy and good thing related to sports. And it's that sort of booster culture, civic identity that becomes central to the way sports and Christianity are connected. That's the element that carries over into the South. And so Southerners are pretty resistant to muscular Christianity as kind of in the traditional sense, because it's connected to Yankee institutions in the Northeast. But in the 1920s, as Southerners begin to embrace football, They connected instead to civic pride. They connected to cultural traditions that are often shaped by this lost cause ideology. They connected again to the city boosting ideas of football representing the community, and religion is a central part of that. So when you see the South and Southern teams embracing sports and football in particular and praying before games, yeah, it's a deeply rooted tradition that goes back particularly to the 1920s and extends from there. And we could call it a version of muscular Christianity, but I think it's if we're going to say that, we need to separate it from the more classical sense when we think of something like a James Naismith and the YMCA and muscular Christianity that emerged in England.
That's great. Yeah, and that I think calling what we see now muscular Christianity might obscure more than it actually enlightens in terms of what's actually going on. So yeah, that's just getting up to the 1930s. I'm sure the story gets complicated even more between then and today. But I think it's also interesting that there's similar questions around, say, the commercialization of sports that are still at the forefront of how we're talking about it, particularly in recent years in college sports, and the rights of players to be part of that commercialization or benefit from that commercialization, all that type of stuff. There do seem to be some enduring themes or enduring challenges that American sports deals with, and of course people are coming at them differently based on the period we're looking at. Well, we just have a few more minutes with you, Paul, and listeners. I want to remind you that if you enjoy conversations like this, we encourage you to, and you're around Madison in the Madison area, we encourage you to attend events at Upper House in person. You can see our full program on our website at upperhouse.org/events, and many of those events do go online afterward, about a month after, so you can watch them there as well. Paul, just a few minutes with you. One final question before we talk about your book coming up. You are in a seminary. You, as you've talked about, interact with a lot of Christians, a lot of Christian communities around sports. If there's one predominant myth or misunderstanding that you consistently want to correct in a kind, productive way, not a rail against people way, what is that myth when it comes around sports and Christianity? What's the thing that sort of pops up again and again? And how do you sort of try to get people to rethink whatever that thing is?
That's a great question. And I think I would, again, go to context and think audience. So I think a lot of academics, when they think about sports and Christianity, they only emphasize, or they too heavily emphasize, the political. And so sports and Christianity is only about its political meanings, right? So if you see a Dabo Sweeney talk about Jesus after a game, or you see Tim Tebow kneel, or you know Reggie White, if you followed him, for your Wisconsin listeners, when you see these examples of sports and Christianity, it's like a front for something else. It's part of the political movement. It's a right-wing, Christian right initiative, and that's the only frame of reference that I think some scholars have when they think of those connections. And so what I found when I, studied sports and Christianity is that politics are rarely talked about in a direct way by the Christian coaches and athletes themselves. Now, when they are talked about, they get a whole lot of attention from the press. And so there's this sense that that's what it's all about. But actually, what's going on a ground level for most Christian athletes and coaches is, how can I be a successful coach and athlete? Like, how do I win? How do I improve my performance? How do I have a healthy marriage in this demanding environment of sports? How do I follow Jesus when I feel these tensions and pressures? What do I do when I get hurt? How do I make sense of tying up my identity in the performance? So those really practical baseline questions, Richard Mouw, he calls this middle range concerns. Those are the things of everyday sports life that really matter the most in terms of what Christian coaches and athletes are talking about. And so I would say, if I'm, talking to other academics, I would want to say, let's focus on those everyday ordinary meanings in terms of how the Christian faith is applied to the everyday experiences of athletes and coaches. And that's at the heart of how Christians have made sense of sports. Now, when I talk to, let's say, Christian athletes or coaches who are interested in that conversation, or those who aren't academics, to them, I would say it's also at the same time always about cultural and political questions too. Mm-hmm. That is to say, everything it is shaped by context, and it has meanings that extend beyond just what you yourself as an athlete or coach think of when you apply a verse or when you're part of an organization or a network. Even things that you might not be intentionally thinking of, you're bound up in a web of meaning and a narrative that does shape American public life in some ways. And the political and the cultural does shape how Christians have engaged in sports. And that context matters. And so in my own writing, I try to bring out that context and try to say, on the one hand, yes, it's true, athletes and coaches aren't necessarily political activists, many of them. But it's also true that some of the organizations that they develop and some of the ways they engage in sports, it's intended to promote a particular vision of American society and a particular vision of American life. And we can talk about those things, and those things matter. And we shouldn't dismiss that out of hand, but we should try to make sense of, for example, when Colin Kaepernick kneels and we see these different reactions that Christians have to what's going on there, Christianity and how we understand Christianity is going to shape what we think of that. And I think sports gives us a unique lens into understanding our culture, but it also is a force for shaping and changing American culture. And so I'd want to highlight to that group the broader context in which those ordinary everyday experiences take place.
That's great. I think that's the right balance, at least from my perspective. And your last point too, that it's not just that there's a window into culture, but that sports is part of culture in a very significant way. I mentioned I TA'd for a class on sports history. The professor of that class was actually an urban historian who really didn't care much about sports, to be honest. He was much more interested in the politics of stadium funding in major urban areas like Chicago. That's where he focused his, I believe it's the United Center where the Bulls play, but his whole sort of first book was on the politics around the stadium funding and the way it affected the neighborhoods and the bigger city. And so this is something that isn't, I mean, you don't need to ever talk about an actual sports event or sort of people playing sports. It's this much bigger infrastructure. And that's because in American culture, basketball is a massive industry and there's billions of dollars on the line, and that affects a lot of people, even beyond what's happening on the court. So that's all to say, even things that we think are sort of tangential to the actual playing of the sports, like the funding of the stadium, actually have these really important cultural effects that can be studied and should be appreciated, I think, by a lot of people to understand, how sports interacts with different parts of our culture. Okay, well, that gets us to a final question. You have your book coming out, The Spirit of the Game, American Christianity and Big Time Sports, from Oxford University Press, coming out in just a few months. What's the pitch, Paul? What are you covering in this book? And I'm sure you'll be doing this a lot in the next months. What do you cover in this book, and why did you want to write it?
Our conversation gets at a lot of the reasons for why I wanted to write this and some of what I cover. Basically, I cover 100 years of how Christians created a space within American sports to promote their version of Christianity and their version of America. And I look at the 1920s and I continue to the present, and I focus on the big time sports in terms of its infrastructure. So professional sports and college sports. And I look at the meaning Christians made, in particular American Protestants, but then also some organizations they created to institutionalize their presence. And I think this is key. So it's not just a story of Christians writing about sports, but it's organizations like the Fellowship of Christian Athletes and Athletes in Action and Pro Athletes Outreach and Baseball Chapel. And there are these organizations, sports ministries, that have been developed and created and continue to shape how Christian athletes and coaches experience and understand sports. And what's fascinating to me is, like, if we were to go back 100 years ago to the 1920s, there are far fewer Christians in the 1920s in sports talking about their faith than there are in the 2020s, 100 years later. And that counters, most of the stories we've been told about secularization in American life. We're we're told that Christians have less of a presence, that when it comes to higher education and movies and music and all of these cultural activities, we're told that Christianity has been marginalized in some ways, publicly at least. But when you look at sports, the opposite is true. There are way more Christians present and involved and within these institutions. And so in my book, I wanted to tell the story of how did that happen? Like, how did Christians create a home within American sports? And what were the different meanings that they were connecting to sports, and what impact has it had on American culture as a whole? So it's yes, a book about sports, but really I want to use sports as a lens into understanding American Christianity and the different trajectories American Christianity has taken over the last 100 years.
It's excellent. We are particularly interested in this book here at Upper House, serving a university community and a university that has a lot of athletes at it. And so that not just the history of Christianity in sports, but the institutional history of all the different ministries that have popped up to serve athletes, to shape the culture here. Excited to read it, Paul, and congratulations on the book.
And thanks so much.
It's also getting great endorsements. I checked out that right before here, so it's sounding like you'll be talking about it for a good time to come. So get used to the pitch, saying it over and over again, and like it's the first time each time.
Yeah.
So
I'm gonna practice and refine this a little bit. So we're gonna work on that.
It's all good. It's all good. Well, thanks, Paul. Thanks for being with us. Thank you, listeners and watchers, viewers, for tuning into the Upwards podcast. We hope you enjoyed today's conversation. For more information about the Stephen and Laurel Brown Foundation and Upper House, please visit upperhouse.org. And until next time, go in peace.